us as they arrive. I do want to welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you again for being here this evening. And this session is being recorded. I do want to also acknowledge your commitment to the work. It feels like we were just recently here. It is beginning to feel like we never leave the collaboration forum. But that said, I also do want to welcome our board of directors and our PPS staff. Thank you for all that you've done to support this process so far. I know it's a lot of work, it's been time consuming, but your commitment is totally appreciated and not missed. Jed and Flow Analytics, Karina and Brick Architectural Firm, and our principals participated in the work session held last week to review and analyze the D proposals. We will continue tonight as they work to facilitate our discussions in our breakout sessions. And I do want to begin also by acknowledging their presence. They have been with us from the beginning, and I am sure they will see us through. 2 sessions ago, we listened to our language groups and CSS group as they shared information and discussed the trends observed in proposals ABC. These discussions led to the request of more data by SEGC members, and that request will be honored tonight. Slide 2, please. Next slide. Thank you. Before we proceed, I do want to begin by reading the anti-oppression statement for land acknowledgement here at PPS. And at PPS, we strive to strengthen our relationships with our Native communities and sorry, I have part of my screen here covered. At PPS, we strive to strengthen our relationships with the Native community and Native nations. A symbol of this commitment is a land acknowledgement. These statements bring visibility to the First Peoples of our collective home. This statement is meant to provide information and context while also encouraging all of us to reflect on our current day relationship with Native people and Native experiences. We acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional land of the Chinook, the Clackamas, the Kalapuya, the Multnomah, the Wasco, the Cathlamet, the Tualatin, and the Malala peoples. We also know that many other tribes made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. We honor their history and acknowledge the sacrifices they made. Let us also acknowledge the robust present-day federally recognized tribes of this area, the Grand Ronde, the Siletz, the Cowlitz. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the Chinook Nation, who has been seeking federal recognition for many years. The urban Indian community is made up of tribal diversity that originates from around the country, representing 400 tribes. The urban Indian community has a vivid history made up of people whose journeys have brought them to Portland by ways of forced displacement or seeking more opportunities. Next slide, please. Previous slide, please. Today, these tribes and communities celebrate their heritage, showing resilience and tenacity that would be greatly admired by their ancestors. Within Portland Public Schools, today we serve students and families representing more than 150 tribal nations within our education system. It is our obligation to teach accurate information, past and present, about the impacts of colonization on our students, all students today, and make visible the multitude of Native families and many diverse ways Native communities and families are living in the present. We encourage every person to reflect on their own history, understand the history of colonization and genocide, and support Indigenous sovereignty, priorities, and actions. This acknowledgement is one step that we can take to improve our support of Indigenous communities in the area. In addition to acknowledging the land and those that have been here since time began, we must also remember our stolen siblings from Africa, whose labor built the vast wealth of this country. These two communities and the atrocities committed against them are intrinsically intertwined due to our existence within a white supremacist world. Everything we have is due to stolen land and stolen labor, and every system and institution that impacts our lives is built upon this legacy. It is our job to speak that truth into spaces so that we can begin to heal. Next slide, please. Tonight, we will review and discuss options for special program placements. We will strive to reach a consensus around program placements and maybe start looking at boundaries. And we will review the boundaries that are available to us as options of choice. Next slide, please. That said, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Karina.
Thank you, Dr. O.
Sure.
So, welcome everyone. It's as it is normally my job in these meetings. I always start with just having us, quite frankly, at this point, take a moment to breathe, just take a few deep breaths. We know that there is a lot going on in the school district. There's a lot going on right now in our personal lives and our professional lives. And so just a reminder to, and an acknowledgement, right, that we're making time for an important conversation. And we're doing that at a time when a lot of us are feeling pulled in a lot of different directions. So first of all, I just want to echo the gratitude that Dr. O talked about, and then also remind you all to, as best you can, try and be present in these conversations and stay engaged for the time that we're together tonight. You also see on your screen the remaining group agreements or the other group agreements that we've kind of acknowledged as we've decided how we're going to be in community with one another. And so want to take a moment to allow you all to process those and let us know if there are any questions. Raise your hand if there's something you need added to make you better able to participate this evening. All right, next, Marnie. So as usual, tonight we will be going into actually 2 series of breakout rooms. So we will not be able to, anyone from the public won't be able to listen live to those conversations, but they will be recorded and will be available on the Enrollment and Program Balancing website by tomorrow afternoon. And with that, I am going to invite Claire to give us a bit of an update and a summary of where we find ourselves.
Good evening. So I've heard from quite a few of you in the past week, and so I just want to do some reminders. One is that we really want to remember to center our work on our Black, Native, and BIPOC students, and as we are making our recommendation, or the Southeast Guiding Coalition is making a recommendation. And that it's hard work to evaluate trade-offs. And as you know, we continue to look at proposals. What we know is there is not the perfect proposal. There will be trade-offs, and that sometimes focusing on refining one will get us there rather than adding more and more proposals. Looking at how do we refine what we have looked, because we have done quite a few proposals throughout this process already. So we have brought 2 proposals to you today, an E1 and an E2, that Jed will be sharing with you later. And it is based on feedback from the Southeast Guiding Coalition members from last time. And so we took D1 and created the E1 proposal, including combining Bridger's DLI with Lent to become a neighborhood lottery all DLI school with a single Spanish strand remaining at Atkinson. And then we also developed an E2. We wanted to be able to compare 2 distinctly different proposals with the Mandarin program at Kellogg. And that E2 is based on the former D3 and also includes that Bridger DLI moving to Lent and Atkinson DLI students staying as is. Also, just reminding you the focus of our work. Our board has asked us to focus on Harrison Park and Lane Middle Schools as the primary focus of our recommendation. And I've been asked specifically about Title I consideration. And one thing that I would say about Title I consideration is that we are making, in the Southeast Guiding Coalition, long-term boundary and program placement decisions. And for the Southeast, and Title I status is reviewed annually. And new schools are added and others are removed as neighborhoods change over time. So just a reminder that one is maybe our decision is for long-term, and title can fluctuate as communities change. Also that I've added a third bullet onto this summary slide. This goes back to the board policy about, it's called the student assignment policy. And really the focus of boundary and program changes are listed there. Really about creating robust programs in all of our Southeast schools, allowing feeder patterns for students to continue together, looking at student demographics, compact boundaries, promoting safe routes to school, the optimal use of our facilities, and thinking about the program and enrollment stability in surrounding schools, and then limiting the impact of boundary changes. Now, it's not possible to do all of those because of the trade-offs I spoke about earlier, but I just want us to remember that's our primary focus that's in our board policy and what our board has asked us to focus on Harrison Park and Lane Middle Schools in this whole process. So with that, I'll turn it back. Am I turning it back to Karina?
You can. We'll go straight into our co-chair corner.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's Beth or Adrielle or a combination of them.
I think I'm taking the lead on this one today, right, Adrielle?
Right.
So I just wanted to elevate a couple of the things that came up between this week's and last week's meeting, and some of those are directly related to what Claire just talked about. So one of the things people wanted some more clarity on was around that DLI, the Spanish DLI program placement options. Some of the conversation at the end of last week's meeting felt limited, and people just wanted to know, are we limited to that, or are we still looking at both? So I think that's been addressed. There were also some questions that came up around sort of as we're thinking about the staffing considerations at Kellogg, are there other things that we should be thinking about? What other sort of staffing things come up? Because a lot of these proposals move a lot of, or multiple DLI program placements. The next piece that it speaks to what Claire just said, reviewing our outcome goal to support equitable programming to improve the middle school experience, particularly at Harrison Park and Lane Middle Schools, and sort of revisiting that focus. And then we had some questions come up asking for clarity on the terms we used and how that, like, if or how they should be prioritized. We got some clarity on Discord about some of these earlier today. There's a term that, from what I understand, is a state of Oregon Department of Education term, historically underserved, and PPS intentionally uses the term underserved instead, because we've seen that that underserved continues to this day. It's not just historical. We've got, and now correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but that underserved student category is specifically talking about our racial and ethnic groups who are underserved. So there's a different term, combined underserved, that then includes low-income students, special education students, ELL students, as well as the underserved racial and ethnic groups. So if anybody else wants to hop in and help out with those terms, that would be great. But I think that's sort of, those are some of the things that rose to the top this week. Do you have anything to add, Adrielle?
Not today. I've been a little disconnected. So I'm just now getting caught up with some of the conversation. So I think you're good to go.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. And now for the belle of the ball, Jed, will you join us in share the new scenarios that you have developed. So next slide, Marnie.
Fell of the ball.
I was going to say, have you ever been called that?
Never. I was just.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Well, thanks, Karina, for that. And I also want to thank Jenny and big thanks to Ethan for really doing a ton of work to actually develop this stuff. So I certainly can't take much credit here for pulling these things together. But I just want to revisit first off that this is just a reminder for folks real quick here that the 2021 enrollment estimates that you see in the data sheets, those are again based on actual counts from this year now. So I showed this slide last time, but just for folks that may not have been here last week, that's what we're doing now and going forward. And I would just recommend that folks visit the last link there just to see all the new information that's out for the 2021 school year. All the different demographic information, lots of good stuff on the system planning and performance webpage. And there's also a link here to show just a comparison of actual enrollment to the, to the forecast for 2021 that we were using in place of actual data. And just again, a reminder for folks, the reason that we were doing that is so we could get an enrollment estimate for Kellogg, which did not exist in 2020, which is why we couldn't use that data, which was the last official actual stuff. So with that said, let's just go ahead and jump into the draft proposal E-series work that we did this week. Next slide. And so this is a slide that has one major change here. And so this comes out of the discussion that we had last week about Spanish DLI at the K-5 level and interest in seeing a model or a set of scenarios that include Spanish DLI at Atkinson and at Lent. And as it says here, Atkinson would remain a single strand co-located program. And the big change would be that Lent converts to a whole school Spanish DLI program by welcoming the existing Bridger strands and also having an opt-in option for the neighborhood students. Folks that were families and students that are zoned in the attendance area for Lent, their default program would be Spanish dual language immersion. The other two pieces here, creative science and Chinese DLI, remain the same as we talked about last week with the proposal D options. So that's the big change at the K-5 level. And so with the next slide here, I'm going to get into what this looks like from a feeder standpoint. And because actually most of the change here was really at that K-5 level, we're able to do a couple things that Claire talked a little bit about earlier, which is in the case of E1 here, it's going to look really, really similar to what D1 is. So at the middle school level, we're seeing the same kinds of numbers here as far as the schools that are under enrolled, where you see the enrollment highlighted in yellow, and the schools that are above our 80% utilization, so over enrolled, which you see that percentage there highlighted in yellow. And so again, we're seeing Kellogg and Hosford in E1 here being the overutilized schools. And we're seeing that Selwood and Mount Tabor are the schools with the low enrollment, below that 500 target that we're looking for. And again, there's possible but no direct path to shifting Kellogg's enrollment to balance out Selwood and Mount Tabor. So it'd really be kind of a domino effect to try and move some of that out. And we will hopefully start to talk a little bit more about the boundary piece and how we can make moves toward trying to smooth out some of this enrollment where it makes sense. And just highlighting the split feeder patterns here are with Atkinson, with its Spanish immersion program meeting the Lent program at Kellogg. And then Woodstock here would be split between the Chinese DLI program going to Harrison Park and the neighborhood program remaining at Hosford. And so, and just, yeah, again, big headline here that I should have mentioned right out of the top. Middle school Chinese DLI is consolidated at Harrison Park in E1, and middle school Spanish DLI is consolidated at Kellogg. Okay, next slide, please. So E2 is actually a feeder graphic that looks really similar to D3 from last week. So headline here is that really you're just flipping Chinese DLI and Spanish DLI at the middle school level. Here we have Chinese DLI consolidated at Kellogg and Spanish DLI consolidated at Harrison Park. And so we see Mount Tabor is the overutilized school. In this scenario here, Hosford and Selwood are below our 500 enrollment target. There is some potential balancing that we could do between Kellogg and Mount Tabor to help out Hosford here that we would talk about when looking at the boundaries. Similarly, there's probably some work that we could do to shift from Lane to Selwood, but just where Selwood's at, it's probably going to be tough to get to the 500 mark just between those two schools. And again, split feeders here, Atkinson and Woodstock again. We have Atkinson now feeding back to Mount Tabor where it is, the neighborhood program. And we have the Spanish DLI feeding to Harrison Park, so a split there. Woodstock, now that split is between Kellogg for Chinese DLI and Hosford for the neighborhood. And then Clark, formerly Harrison Park, Chinese DLI program there would be split between Harrison Park as the neighborhood and Kellogg as the Chinese DLI location. And so again, we see the highlights here as far as the yellow highlight of the low enrollment schools and the high utilization here too. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to revisit these slides from last time, showing the differences in the utilization just in table form here. Again, because at the middle school level, we're really seeing the same effects as D1 and D3 from last time. If you compare back to those, you'll actually see the same numbers here. So, so you can see again, nothing perfect in either of these as far as being able to meet all of our targets. Next slide, please. These, again, the same statistics for E1 and E2 as compared back to D1 and D3. We see in general for low income students that rate decreases. And I just want to be clear because I got this question a couple times last week. This is not as a result of just changing of demographics in the neighborhoods over time. This is a result of redrawing boundaries such that there are different populations of students attending schools, redrawing boundaries as well as moving programs. That's also a part of what changes the demographics of the population of students at a specific school. So again, we see that go down mostly for all of these. Next slide, please. Similarly, with our BIPOC students, we see that percentage go down, again, because it's a new population of students that we're modeling at these schools, not due to forecasted demographic change, which we do know is happening, but is not part of what is forecasted for the district when Portland State University provides its enrollment forecast. Next slide, please. And similarly with English language learners, we're seeing those percentages drop as well, again, based on the new populations of students assigned to the schools. Next slide. And so for the E-series here, we put together the racial equity impact measures that you folks have seen in previous meetings here. Just want to point out that relative to the baseline, we're seeing that we're not able to hit the 500 enrollment target as often as we were currently for middle schools, but we are increasing our ability to hit the 270 enrollment mark for elementary schools here. And then kind of the flip side of those two measures above, you see that have relatively low percentage of schools that are above that 80% utilization piece. And then we've seen pretty regularly that the percentage of students within a mile of their school has stayed fairly steady compared to the 2021 baseline right now. And then also we see at the bottom the number of students that from the perspective of the current school are now attending a different school. They're at a different building than they were before. And so we can now flip to E2 and we can see the difference there. We see that it's a little bit lower across the board for the percentage of students that are at a middle school with greater than that 500 enrollment target. A little bit, it's actually pretty similar for the elementary. And then again, on that flip side, because we have fewer of the schools hitting that 500 mark, we also have a little bit more of the schools, a little bit fewer of the schools that are above that 80% utilization. And again, percentage of students within 1 mile is pretty close to the baseline. And we have actually more affected students overall and fairly similar numbers for our Black and Native and ELL students between the two here. Next slide. And so similar to what we prepared last week, there is a description of the different pieces that make up each of these two scenarios. And there's also a chart that shows the different program assignments. And I know for folks that were able to jump on this really quickly last night as this stuff was coming out, we were getting good feedback from folks on some editorial changes that needed to be made. So if you have a printed copy of some of these materials, you may have seen some things that were a little bit different than what you actually have printed, either what is on my slides or what's in the G Drive folder right now. So right now what's up on the G Drive and what you'll see in the Miro board is the very latest and greatest. So just know that if you have printed copies with you right now. And with that, I believe I'm kicking it back to Karina.
You are indeed. Thank you, Jed.
Yeah.
But stay tuned because before we get to this, actually, if you'll go up, because we're not going to get into duos and quads yet, we've got about 10 minutes to open it up if anyone has any questions, any sort of comments for the group, and specifically questions about proposals E1 and E2 for Jed. Raise your hand or put a note in the chat. Andy.
I have a quick clarifying question about the projections for the Mandarin program in these. Is this like the final, like I know that program is growing or like there's aspirations for it to grow. So do these reflect sort of the final state of those numbers, or is there an assumption that they might continue growing past 2025? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Andy, it does. Right now, based on the 2025 projections, there are 44 students projected to be at the recently started Harrison Park program. And so that adds in with the, I think 130 or so that are projected to be at the Hosford program. So yeah, 44 students, not a lot at that Harrison Park program. So we're definitely talking about a single strand there. So it does not in that estimate include any growth, at least right now, into a multiple strand program, or even like a really, I think, robust single strand program at 44. That's pretty skinny.
And I mean, does anyone at PPS can anyone speak to sort of what is there a particular aspiration we're working toward there, or we should just assume that this is the long-term state?
What's the question again, Andy, please?
Just whether the size that we're seeing of like the size of the Mandarin immersion program in these projections, should we assume that's kind of the long-term size, especially of the Clark, the one in Clark that would then feed onto middle school? Like, is it going to remain that size indefinitely, or is it likely to grow?
Well, we're hoping to grow the program, but I'm not sure how quickly we're going to be able to do that. So that's the caveat.
Andy, I can add that anytime we're starting a program, and this is true when the Woodstock program started some 20 years ago, those pioneer groups, the first groups of students, tend to be smaller cohorts. I know that Harrison Park is working hard to recruit and retain students in the program. It is limited to neighborhood-only students at this time, and we don't have an immediate plan to expand beyond that. Obviously, there's really important configuration things happening that we want to make sure are in place before we add additional students from outside the neighborhood. And the COVID has had a lot of impact across the board on students opting in to immersion programs. So this is maybe a short term that the enrollment might be these smaller cohorts. The goal is to have full, robust, single strand cohort, and that would affect the enrollment.
Thank you, Judy. Sheila.
Hi, everyone. So I'm curious about numbers. So when we look at our goal for all the middle schools is to have at least 500 students enrolled at each middle school. But then we also know that our middle schools, their capacity varies greatly. So, if you look between like Mount Tabor and Harrison Park, there's just physically a lot more room at Harrison Park. So I'm curious from a perspective of staff, if there's any concerns about, even if we reach that 500 level, are there concerns about there being kind of a lower utilization rate at some of our larger schools? Or do we really feel that with that 500 level, we'll be able to offer that robust set of middle school classes and courses that we're hoping for?
So Sheila, along those lines, what we had said was what was the minimum number that would allow us to run those robust programs. And we settled at 500. Our goal and our desire is really to grow it beyond that. We actually went as far as 700, and then we backed up based on the enrollment numbers in the district. So if we're able to grow beyond 500, yes, that's what we would like to see, because the more students, the more robust programs we can offer. But that's the barest minimum that would allow us to offer those services to our students.
I think the other side of that, right, is the utilization side. You want to provide as many students as you can while still keeping it under the target utilization rate. Beth.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, another element that I see is sort of the balance across the region. So when we start to have some schools that are at 700 plus students, that makes it harder to get over that 500 mark in other schools. So when I'm thinking, okay, if 500 is the floor, do I feel good about 500 or even 550? If we've got other schools that are significantly higher than that, does that feel like we're going to have equitable resources and experiences at both of those schools. So I'm also trying to think about like, how do we balance across the region?
So Beth, there's always an element of choice, especially with our parents, as you know. So what we're hoping for is exactly what you said, a balance. But if it so happens that a middle school has a whole lot more students than another middle school, what we're then hoping for is that within our program offerings, we can create some kind of equity so that at least children have or students have exactly what they need to thrive. We may not be able to provide everything, but at least we'll be able to provide the more important things that would help our students in the future.
Thank you, Dr. O.
Sure.
Anyone else? Any questions? Jed, there's a request for you in the chat. Is there, the desire is for you to recap what plausible options there might be for getting Kellogg a little less crowded in, specifically in proposal E1.
Karina, I wonder if maybe we defer that to the breakout session, or are we going to be talking specifically about boundary stuff?
I think that's a good call.
It's a big topic around that piece.
Fair enough. That's a very good idea. Okay. Anyone else? D.
Are we moving into, Brett, just kind of a procedural question. Are we moving into the breakout groups?
Yeah, so what we're going to do, that's a good preview for everyone tonight. So I'll give you kind of an overview of the path for tonight. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to break up into duos for 5 minutes, and then we're going to kind of debrief those duos in what we call quads. So we'll bring 2 sets of duos together and have you kind of cross-pollinate ideas, talking about what you've heard tonight and up to tonight, right? With a kind of prompt. And then we're going to bring those groups back. We're going to do a quick set of polls just to, again, kind of get a pulse, a fist of 5 from where folks are. And then we're going to break up into our first set of breakouts. We're going to break up into 2 rooms that people will be able to self-select. The first one is to talk about program placement. And the second one is to start looking specifically at neighborhood boundaries, or at boundaries, right? So for folks that we've heard very clearly from folks, we're tired of talking about program placement. We want to get into boundaries. So allowing them to do that. And we're going to come back together, talk about those, try and reach consensus around program placement. Again, take another poll, and then everyone then is going to talk about boundaries. And we're going to go into the 3 rooms that we've been historically using, our river rooms, but each river room will be looking at what we call kind of middle school feeder duos, right? So they'll be looking at boundaries, but kind of in a more parsed way. So that way the flow folks can adjust boundaries or move those around more succinctly, because I think there's something like 29 maps that kind of overlay of schools that are impacted. So that's kind of the long-term trajectory of the night. Did that answer your question?
It did. And I do have a comment, but
go ahead.
Okay. So as we're moving into sort of like the discussions about the final program placements, I just wanted to take a minute and if we're centering our work on BIPOC students, I just wanted to take a minute to have a few thoughts before we move into it, because it feels like we're in this mad scramble and we're really like drowning in logistics and numbers. And it took, I'm sure for the rest of you, it took, half of my workday today to sort of go through all of this stuff and try to figure out, look at the numbers, and then we're asking clarifying questions about the numbers, and we're talking about percentages, and it just feels very inaccessible to our families that are watching this and trying to figure out like how these outcomes are going to happen. And so I just wanted to just say something about recentering sort of BIPOC families in this process. We've heard throughout this process the DLI program models within PPS are designed to close the achievement gaps between emerging language learners. And I think it's really important to recenter. I feel like the DLI programs the tone feels like it's like the it seems like a problem. It's emerging to feel like, okay, like what do we do about this problem that is DLI? And I just wanted to center again as we move into this, just the importance of these programs as social justice tools, and then there isn't a misconception that these programs are somehow more important than neighborhood programs, or that they're separate from neighborhood programs, or they should be independently considered from the neighborhood program. I personally am a BIPOC person, and I experienced the American educational system as an immigrant and also as an emerging language learner. And when you're an emerging language learner, you have this additional burden of navigating your experience, both as a child, but also as an adult. You're explaining to your parents, like, what's a PTA? Why do I need to go on play dates? And it's a very isolating experience. And I feel like if you are part of a dominant race in a situation, you're not always aware of how these kids experience life in school in particular. For example, like we see all the time in our DLI program, cultures behave differently. Big, close, extended families is really common in Latinx populations and in my culture as well. And we're trained not to interrupt. So it's so often the kids of color are characterized as problem children because they're poorly behaved and they're being judged based on dominant culture norms. And it's just been clearly demonstrated through research and literature that these negative associations shape a child's behavior and perception. And there's increased rates of incarceration, poor health, generally less favorable outcomes. And being a child who's constantly experiencing this level of vigilance around being like an other, it changes the way you think about how you speak, what you eat, how do you fit in. Your existence is dominated by, you're not focusing on your education, you're trying to just fit in. And it feels like this really uphill battle for these kids. And there's just anxiety and stress, and it translates into these lower outcomes. And the point of an immersion experience is to give these kids like a safe and nurturing space where they can be themselves and find acceptance culturally and like personally from their dominant culture peers. And I feel like if we are so focused on the logistical issues about balancing enrollment, instead of talking about we talk about these programs as diminishing the experience of neighborhood programs, but I feel like we've heard from our communities that a well-executed immersion program bridges the cultural gaps that have historically burdened underrepresented groups, and creating safe spaces within the school community for these kids to thrive and like truly belong to a whole community is something that benefits the whole neighborhood community. It's not about benefiting like a specific population of people. The intent is that this is a whole school, whole community endeavor. And I feel like if we're going to move forward on the value of principles and equity that we state at the beginning of all of our meetings, I think it's important that we not continue to separate and think about the DLI programs as a separate, we're not guests in a program, we're just not separate. And this perception that high SES families are dominating the DLI conversation is certainly true. But I don't think the solution is to villainize the DLI programs as being a cause of any inequity. I think we just need to examine how we lottery in non-native speakers and consider where the program placements can be to create our best integrated communities with the best educational opportunities. And at Bridger, we've embraced relinquishing our space to CSS because we see them as another focus option, and they bring important choice to the families in our part of the city, but particularly in our school, where the inequity that's been experienced by the single strand neighborhood program has created a situation that doesn't fit with our values of equity and community that we have developed there. And so we have been working to try to be part of the solution for this whole community. But the incredible and unexpected success of the DLI program at Kellogg, as the SCG debates where the Bridger Brand Spanish should go and where the Kellogg's, where the placement should be at Kellogg, we as a community made a concerted effort we understood how valuable that program placement was to our native speakers. And we sought to be flexible for a K-5 placement that logically put us into a feeder school for Kellogg so that it wasn't disruptive to neighborhood programs or to enrollment. That was the intent of sort of the process that we've been going through. And as you know, Kellogg has a strong DLI program, and it's complete with culturally competent staff and wraparound services. And we're just not operating in a vacuum, and it's not realistic to expect PPS to recreate that in another building. And so for our community, our BIPOC community in particular, dismantling a program feels like it's just erasing these hard-won gains and a lot of compromise that our community has engaged in this process with. And particularly when we're receiving really clear feedback from our BIPOC families, about keeping the DLI at Kellogg and coming up with a logical and thoughtful placement for the K-5 program. And we've had listening sessions, and we've invited our BIPOC families into this process and promised them and took their trust that this feedback would be heard in this process, and it wouldn't just be all asking sacrifice with no gain. And our BIPOC community is built on solidarity and connection, and they trusted our assurances that their input and feedback was important. So going down the road of solely focusing on numbers and statistics down to like the minute detail is in direct opposition to the outcome that our BIPOC community has asked for, and feels like an abuse of the trust that we asked for and that we promised when we engaged BIPOC communities into this process. These communities do not experience a lot of success within the school system, so taking away success when in the history of PPS, no successful program in an affluent neighborhood has ever been asked or forced to relinquish the situation that benefits their children, particularly to have faith that a new unknown circumstance is going to be just as good as better. And watching this discussion and this complicated discussion of statistics and numbers, I just don't want the people in this process to be lost. And so as parents of color, we urge you to do better than buying into a scarcity and zero mindset, some mindset. We are continuing to put our trust and faith in the process and ask that you return the trust and the faith by not disregarding the feedback that we have given.
Thank you, Dee. Okay, Adriel, and then we're going to need to move on to our duos to kind of keep on time, but this is an important discussion, and thank you for bringing that to light and recentering us, Dee. So, Adriel.
I mean, I think this might be a discussion or a topic for another moment, but I just want to say that we often, when we say BIPOC, we use that to lump a lot of cultures and a lot of communities together. And when we started this process, we talked about the lack of support and the lack of access and the experiences that the African American and the Native American students and their families were having. And so I just want to make sure that we're zeroing in a little bit on that as well. A lot of these changes that we're discussing making, and Beth and I talked a bit about this earlier, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a real impact either way on the African American families or the Native American families. One, because there's so few of them in many of these spaces, particularly in the Spanish DLI or the Japanese or in the Mandarin even, depending on the school that you go to. And so while we're talking about social justice and experiences, I think it's important to note that some of the experiences of the historically and currently underserved African American and Native American families are not going to be addressed when we make these shifts if we don't address what's diminishing their experiences, which is increasing people that mirror their culture in these spaces. And so, like I said, this might be a conversation for another time. I know that Claire and I have talked about some plans, but it's really important to state that when you already have a very small community of people in a space and you're dealing with a lack of representation in that space, you're not going to be able to impact their experiences. And I want to make sure that we keep a light shined on the necessity to address that when we're making these changes as well, and how these changes might have some level of impact on those small communities as we shift. Like, I don't know, I couldn't see the numbers at Kellogg of African American and Native American students, but I know there's not a lot at a lot of these schools. And I just want to make sure that they don't get lost in this process and in the thought, because their voices are not wholly here. And I want to make sure that there's a thought around that as we move in this space.
Thank you, Adriel. Yeah, I mean,
Karina, may I say something? Really
sure, Dr. O.
Okay. Thank you, Adriel and Dee, for your comments. They're well taken. But I do want to just state that when we started this process, we started out by looking at how we can provide very robust programs to support our middle school students in general. As we travel to the road of trying to do that, we realize that a lot of our DLI programs are not meeting the needs of our students. Of course, yes, we do have a few very successful ones, but for the ones that are fledgling and are not able to support students like we intended for them to, we started then looking at how we're going to provide the services, the supports, and the needs. What do we need to do to restructure? What do we need to do to provide the academic experiences our students need? What do we need to do to meet the needs of the emergent bilingual students? That's how we got into talking about numbers. Because the smaller the numbers you have in different programs, the less opportunities you're going to be able to provide to students. So while it seems as if numbers are the overriding conversations right now, it truly isn't. What really is driving the conversation remains the need to meet the academic experiences of our students, especially those in the DLI programs whose needs are not currently being met because they are in an environment that is not as well supported. So, and in creating a DLI program, the whole idea or notion behind that also is to make sure that we are able to meet the needs of all kids. So if it's a Spanish DLI, it doesn't mean that the only kids who are going to be in that program will be those of Spanish descent or those who are native speakers of Spanish. It's open to everybody. So the idea of still having them immersed in the American experience still holds true for all our students. And we're going to continue to work on that and to refine it and to make sure that we get to a point where truly we can support teacher, we can support students, we can support the families, and we can look at the models we have going forward while centering our BIPOC kids or our students of color in all environments and all spaces.
Thank you, Dr. O. Okay, so with that, what we wanted to do, like I said, is Nathan's gonna break us up into, first you're gonna get broken up into duos, and then you'll get broken up into sets of duos to kind of cross-pollinate ideas from what you hear from one another as you take in what you've heard tonight. So Marnie, if you will advance the slide for us, please. And really what we want you to focus on in these duos is just how can we do what Dee and Adriel and Dr. O just talked about, right? So what are ways to best impact in a positive way communities who've borne the greatest educational outcome disparity and inequity historically. And so that's what we want you to focus on. We're going to send you into the first breakout room for 5 minutes, and then the next breakout room for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back from there. So with that, I think Nathan's going to send folks. Welcome back. Hope you had good conversations in your duos and then in your quads. Marnie, if you'll move to the next slide. So we wanted to take, now that hopefully you've had some good conversations in your duos and quads, a series of polls, what we call pulse polls, your fists to fives. And so Nathan has set those up. He will get the first one up on the screen now. The first question, and again, if you don't see your poll come up, go along the bottom and you should see polls as an option for you. So the first poll, and we've tried to break these up as best we can. Choose the option for you that you support the most for the placement of K-5 Spanish DLI. You get a single choice with a whole school at Lent and co-location at Atkinson, or co-location at Arleta and Lit. Again, we're limiting the voting to SEGC members and principal representatives, please. Okay. I think we've reached critical mass here, Nathan, on this one. Okay, when you'll share the results. Yep. So it looks like we've got 3/4 of the group, so 74% looking at Lent and Atkinson, and a quarter at Arleta and Lent. So again, we're using these just to kind of get a pulse where everyone is, and then we're going to kind of carry these conversations into our small groups. So poll number 2, please. So poll number 2, again, choose the option that you support the most for middle school Chinese DLI, Kellogg or Harrison Park. Okay, we're reaching critical mass. Give a minute. Okay, you end the poll and share it, Ethan, please. So here we're a little bit more or a little bit less clear. 61% at Harrison Park and almost 40% at Kellogg for Chinese DLI. And I'm sure you all can imagine what the final poll will be. It will be about middle school placement for poll number 3. Middle school placement for DLI. So vote, please. Couple more votes to come in here. Okay. So interesting that it wasn't the exact inverse, but fairly close to the inverse from where we were last time. 59% Kellogg and 41% Harrison Park. Okay. So what we're going to do now, thank you, Nathan, if you'll stop sharing those. Okay, so what we're going to do now, Marnie, next slide, please, is we're going to go into the small breakout rooms. We're going to be making up a little bit of time, so we're going to do this for 25 minutes. And you will see, Nathan, when we send everyone to breakout rooms, or when we open the breakout rooms, I should say, you will see 2 options. That you will see an option for folks that still want to talk about program placement around the E1, E2, and anything prior to that. And then you'll see a group or a room for folks that are ready to kind of talk about boundaries, right? So we're leaving this up to you to self-select. We hope that there are enough people in each room to be able to do that. The flow folks will be in the boundary room with Marnie and Elisa, and the district subject matter experts and I will be in the program placement room, and we will go there. Okay, Nathan, if you open those up for us. So again, you should see breakout rooms coming up, and you should be able to select whether you're going to boundaries or program placements.
So we can call one of the rooms program and one of the rooms boundaries, and then people will know which one to choose, Nathan?
Because I'm still seeing the old breakout rooms, the pods and the duos.
Nathan's just naming them. It'll be up in just a second. Thank you for being patient, everyone.
Thank you. Marnie and or Elisa, don't forget to record in your room.
So you can just go to that breakout room, and you all the way to the right of boundaries and program, there should be a little button that says join, and you can just click on the room you'd like to go to. It's corresponding in the mural board that I just sent. If you don't see that, if you're on a Mac, it might have a number, and if you just hover over the number, it will change to join.
So thank you. Welcome back, everyone. If, I don't know, either Elisa or Marnie, I think Marnie, you're a typical sharer. If you'll share back, I think it would be beneficial. Well, we did not reach a sort of program placement decision in the room that was scheduled to talk about program placement. I don't think everyone's back, so I'm just going to stop for a minute until everyone gets back. There we are.
I think it was a little bit different. You needed to actively leave, which caught me off guard. I was a little
okay. I think everyone's almost back now, right? Nathan, you let me know if I feel like we're as back as we're going to be. Okay. So I was saying, I don't know that we necessarily got well, I know that we did not get to resolution in the program placement room, but I think it warrants a larger discussion because we can't get to boundaries until we land this particular ship. So Marnie, will you share screen? And then Judy, will you give us a rundown on what were the majority of the topics that we talked about in our program placement room? Oh, and Judy, you should be able to get out of Miro now. So hopefully that improves your bandwidth. And is Judy with us?
I'm here. Is the other room going first?
No, well, you're going, our room's going first.
I missed that part. Hey, all right. That was a robust conversation. Let's see. E1 is most appealing to the most people. However, there were strong and persistent concerns that in this option, middle schools are imbalanced, particularly Harrison Park doesn't have enough students. And Kellogg would have so many that it might even be more crowded than it is now. And that's with Creston moving out. There was brief discussion of other feeder schools that could move. And there didn't seem to be any strong elements that wanted to put another school on the table. So a lot of the discussion, it was good discussion. It was discussion about the impact of creative science staying sort of north of Division and that neighborhood impact not being closer to more schools that used to be K-8s. There's a real concern about low enrollment at K-5s and not having the necessary 200, the minimal 270 students. An interest in making sure that 270 neighborhood goes with the neighborhood enrollment at co-located schools so that co-located neighborhood strands aren't as volatile. And we heard about Harrison Park being a really hard location for Marysville families. We also heard from Carmen at Lent strong concerns about the impact of being whole school DLI on neighborhood families who are not in the program now or who would not be a part of the program in the future, feeling that is breaking apart a community, that it's a big blow and a slap in the face and not what the community wants. So I think that had people thinking as well. Those are the big ones that are standing out for me.
Those
I'm
are the big
sure
ones
that there
I
are more.
heard too. Yeah. Anyone else that was in that room want to bring something to light that hasn't been that Judy didn't highlight? Raise your hand. Oops, go to my hand raising area. Okay. Beth.
I was waffling. I guess the thing that I really wanted to get to was there definitely seems like a lot of rallying around E1, particularly citing Spanish immersion at Kellogg. But what I haven't heard yet, or I've tried brainstorming, and what I was hoping I could hear from the group was, what are ways that we could make E1 work better so that we have more balance, so that we feel like we're centering Harrison Park and that we feel good about the enrollment there, that we don't have overcrowded schools, that what are our options? What can we do? And so where I'm at right now is I'm not seeing solutions that make E1 work better. And so to me, E2 seems like a better starting place in a lot of ways, because I was hoping we could figure out ways to make E1 seem like a better starting place to me, but I'm not there yet.
Okay, and we'll ask Jed to kind of give you a heads up before I go to Dr. O. We'll have you kind of share back with the whole group some of the things you talked about when you came and joined us in the placement group about getting to answer Beth's question, which is, what are ways to get more even enrollment in E1? All right, Dr. O.
Part of what they also said in the room that we were in is that it is the location of Harrison Park that's more of a challenge, and this is because I guess there are major streets that run through the area, and how do we mitigate for that?
Yeah, that's true. That we did hear that, indeed. Okay,
if I
Jen.
could add
Oh,
one
go
thing
ahead.
upon reflection, I'll be brief.
Go ahead.
I think people are at a place where they don't want to be driven only by the numbers, and they're
Yeah.
not really sure how the numbers will interpret to programs and opportunities, and not just opportunities in general, but really serving kids. And that gap, that distance between like what a number that you see on paper and a real opportunity for students, I think is something that makes it harder for people to be invested in either of these options. I definitely heard people coming from the place that they know best, but when it comes to things that aren't in place yet, it's hard. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think it was underlying a number of these conversations about the importance of enrollment numbers and what kind of resources they would truly reflect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, Jed.
So this is the comment around how to help get Kellogg in E1, how to get its enrollment dispersed out a little bit more, right? Because it's
how to increase enrollment at Kellogg.
Yeah.
Or sorry, increase enrollment at Harrison Park in E1.
Yeah. Well, specifically Harrison Park we're talking about. Then yeah, really, you need to look at the two, neighborhood feeder schools that we have, alongside the Spanish immersion program at Kellogg. And right now, those are Arleta and Marysville. From a proximity standpoint, Marysville is the closest of those two to Harrison Park, but we're talking about many major road crossings: Holgate, Powell, Division, 82nd. And we're talking about some pretty major changes to its attendance area, I think, to make that work. Have some contiguity with Lent as something that's going to feed over to Kellogg as a whole school Spanish DLI. So major changes there. The other direction that one can go that doesn't directly help Harrison Park, but we'd really be opening up, I think, the playbook on boundary changes in either of these cases would be Arleta feeding to Lane, and just the major changes that would need to happen from a boundary standpoint to make that happen. I mentioned in the room, if you could imagine Arleta's boundary being completely south of Foster and then feeding onto Lane, that's the kind of change that could be made to move that school out of the Kellogg feeder to reduce enrollment there and get a bit more at Lane. And you also might find yourself in a situation, we may find ourselves, I should say, in a situation where Lewis is then not needed as a whole school feeder change into Lane to get its enrollment up, with Arleta moving from Kellogg to Lane. So that could possibly go back to Sellwood. So those are just, those are big changes in the area around Foster, Holgate Road there to make either of those feeder changes work to one of those middle schools with those two elementaries.
Thanks, Jed. Okay, so Marnie, we probably should share back any breakthrough ideas that came out of the boundary discussion. And I don't know if you're sharing or if Elisa's sharing, but go ahead, whoever.
Elisa, do you?
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah. Okay. So we looked at both options. So there wasn't really we asked at one point if there's a preference of one versus the other from a boundary perspective, and pretty much the consensus was it was hard to really make that determination, without knowing the program placement. So talked about a lot of questions about what was the decision-making criteria around the initial boundary adjustments. And so there was information given on that, the consider enrollment balancing, walkability, compactness, and some of those domino effects, right? And Woodstock under E1, the need to increase enrollment, talked about Chavez in terms of boundaries. And there were a lot of discussions of those impacts and how transportation was really a crucial component and something that was unknown, right, in alleviating, some of those boundary challenges. And then also major roads, presenting an obstacle with boundary changes, and the relationship of bus routes. Bus routes on major roads are sometimes more efficient, and how that feeds into it. There were a lot of specific discussions around the boundaries, referencing the maps, and in the notes here, even designating, particular areas. So I don't know how much detail to go into here, since we'd have to kind of pull them up to explain some of these. There was a really good point made about community housing centers, and if that was considered in making these making these scenarios. For example, Naya Generations Housing's a Native American housing center located 5 blocks from Marysville. Lots of supports there for families, and so questions about if families would still retain those same resources. Some questions about, staff, whether they'd be able to follow students and families they've been working with for years, and concerns about potentially disruptive changes. We had a similar discussion about strategies to relieve Kellogg's overcrowding in scenario E1, and Ethan led us through some similar solutions that Jed just talked about. And both options, there's some discussion about whether there was any history or benefit to giving certain neighborhoods multiple options, right, to being able to choose between 2 schools, and Margaret discussed some of the challenges associated with that. There were, sounds like some precedents for it, but in very limited circumstances, and not an ideal solution. Discussion about, and we talked about this before in previous meetings, but worries about if Lane were to lose Title I status, what the impacts would be, and then kind of a broader discussion about that. And let's see. So going on to E2. Southwest corner of Atkinson was a concern. There was a discussion about balancing enrollment between Selwood and Lewis. Selwood is under by 100 students, Lane over by 50 students. Selwood actually, low enrollment in both scenarios, how to address that. I think, those are the general things. There's a lot of very specific references again in the Miro board, if anyone wants to go back and explore those. But yeah, I think that captures some of the main themes. But anyone else want to chime in?
No. Okay. So, I think it's important, and I am stalling only a little bit because I'm trying to give Nathan enough time to put a poll together. I think we have to get a pulse from where people are on E1 versus E2 for the whole group. So again, this is a poll that is for SEGC members and principal representatives only. Nathan's done, so he's going to open that. And really what we're trying to get here for you to vote on is trying to get a gauge on where, are you okay with the enrollment levels as is, kind of in this? So that way we can go forward and tweak them to try and make them better, but just trying to get an idea of where people stand at this moment, and we'll see where we end up. Okay, we've got a few more, we're waiting for a few more here. Okay. I haven't seen the number change very, oh, no, we got one more person. We'll give it 20 more seconds. Okay, I haven't seen it move, so go ahead and close it and share. Okay, so we're at about 60-40 with a preference for E2 over E1. Thank you. Thank you, Nathan, for sharing. You can stop sharing at this point. All right, we've got about 7 minutes tonight, so I guess I'll just welcome anyone to give us any last minute thoughts, and then I will close the discussion in just a couple of minutes. And maybe, I don't know, no, I don't see her here. Okay, anyone raise your hand, and then Dr. O, I'll go to you to close.
This is just a really quick technical question. Are those e-maps in the drive somewhere? I didn't see them earlier tonight, but I'd love to get a look at them sometime. I saw the spreadsheet, but not the maps.
Yeah, we'll make sure those are in there, Andy.
Okay.
In the meantime, Miro's got them.
Oh, okay. Got it.
There too, a little more interactively.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. Go ahead and wrap us up, Dr. O, and we'll talk about next steps. I think, yeah, go ahead, Dr. O.
Well, I do again want to just tell you how impressed we are as a PPS staff and how committed you are to this process. It's been a very, very productive night. I was privy to a lot of the conversations and discussions. They were intentional, they were focused, they were centered, and I just want to thank you very much for that. The other thing is that these conversations and discussions point us in the direction that we need to go next. So it is informative and very helpful for us. That said, we'll continue to post our recordings on the SEGC space on the web. And the materials, of course, will be there. The recordings from this evening's breakout sessions will be posted as soon as possible. I want to remind you also to please give us your feedback, complete the surveys. Your surveys inform our decisions and our next steps. And that said, we will see you in 2 weeks. And if you do have any information aside from that, please make sure that we get them during the week so we can factor them into our decision-making process and preparation for the upcoming week.
Thank you, Dr. O. So in terms of next steps, we do have our next meeting in 2 weeks, and additional analysis of these two options will be forthcoming. So keep an eye on your inbox, and thank you again for joining us tonight. Be well, everyone.
See you.